I want you to imagine a quiet street in southeast London on a spring evening in 1993. The kind of night where nothing feels out of place, where the world seems ordinary, predictable, safe. Streetlights glow softly. Traffic hums in the distance. People are heading home, unaware that history is about to change forever. On this night, April the 22nd, an 18-year-old young man named Stephen Lawrence is doing nothing extraordinary. He isn't looking for trouble. He isn't involved in crime. He isn't running late or acting recklessly. He's simply waiting for a bus with his friend, thinking about exams, about the future, about the life he believes lies ahead of him. Stephen Lawrence is young, black, British, and full of promise. He dreams of becoming an architect. He believes in hard work. He believes in fairness. He believes that if you follow the rules, the system will protect you. What Stephen does not know is that in just a few moments, those beliefs will be shattered in the most violent way imaginable. Without warning, a group of strangers will approach. Words will be shouted. Knives will flash. And in less than a minute, Stephen Lawrence's life will be taken from him. Not because of who he is as a person, but because of the color of his skin. But this story is not only about a murder. It is about everything that happened afterward. It is about the moments when the system failed, when evidence was ignored, when justice was delayed, and when truth was buried beneath indifference and prejudice. It is about a family forced to fight not just for answers, but for acknowledgement in a country that refused to listen. The murder of Stephen Lawrence would go on to expose deep flaws in British policing. It would force a nation to confront the reality of institutional racism. It would change laws, transform police procedures, and reshape public conversations about race and justice. But only after years of pain, resistance, and relentless courage from those who refused to let Stephen's name fade into silence. Tonight, I'm telling you the story of Stephen Lawrence, not simply because it is tragic, but because it is essential. Because this case is not locked in the past, its consequences still shape the present. And because understanding what happened to Stephen Lawrence means understanding how easily justice can fail, and how powerful it can become when ordinary people refuse to give up. This is the story of a young man whose life was stolen, a family who would not be silenced, and a crime that changed Britain forever. Before Stephen Lawrence became a name spoken in courtrooms, headlines, and history books, he was simply a teenager growing up in southeast London. He was born on September 13, 1974, into a hard-working family that valued education, discipline, and fairness. From an early age, Stephen stood out, not because he was loud or rebellious, but because he was focused, polite, and quietly ambitious. When I look at Stephen's life before the night of his murder, what strikes me most is how ordinary it was. He attended school, studied for exams, spent time with friends, and talked about his future with the kind of certainty that only youth allows. Stephen wanted to become an architect. He was fascinated by buildings, by structure, by the idea that careful design could shape the world around us. It was not a passing dream. Teachers remember him as dedicated and capable, a student who believed that effort would be rewarded. Stephen avoided trouble. He wasn't known for violence or recklessness. He followed the rules, trusted authority, and believed in the system he was growing up in. Like many teenagers, he had his worries, exams, expectations, the pressure to succeed, but he also carried optimism. He believed Britain was a place where opportunity existed for those willing to work for it. To his parents, Doreen and Neville Lawrence, Stephen was a source of pride. They had raised him to respect others, to aim high, and to believe that fairness mattered. They never imagined that those values, the very things that defined their son, would offer him no protection on the night his life was taken. It's important to understand who Stephen Lawrence was before understanding how he died. Because the tragedy of this case does not begin with violence, it begins with potential. With a young man who was preparing for his A-levels, thinking about university, and looking forward to adulthood. A young man whose future was not uncertain or dangerous, but planned. On April 22, 1993, Stephen left his home as he had done countless times before. There was no sense of danger, no warning, no reason to believe that this ordinary day would be his last. And that is what makes what happened next so devastating. Because Stephen Lawrence did everything right. And still, it wasn't enough. The night Stephen Lawrence was killed did not begin with fear or urgency. It began like so many others, quiet, uneventful, forgettable. Earlier that evening, Stephen met up with his friend Doreen Brooks in Eltham, southeast London. They talked, they laughed, and they passed the time the way teenagers often do, unaware that every ordinary moment was ticking toward something irreversible. As the evening drew on, Stephen and Doreen made their way toward Wellhall Road, planning to catch a bus home. It was around 10:30 at night. The street was dimly lit, but not deserted. Cars passed by. Nearby homes were occupied. Nothing about the setting suggested danger. There was no warning that this stretch of pavement would soon become the scene of a murder. While they waited at the bus stop, a group of white youths approached from across the road. They were strangers to Stephen and Doreen, but not unknown to the area. What followed happened quickly, so quickly that there was barely time to react. Racial slurs were shouted. The atmosphere shifted instantly from calm to chaos. And before Stephen could even fully understand what was happening, the group launched a sudden, violent attack. Knives were drawn. Stephen was struck twice, once in the shoulder and once in the chest. The chest wound was catastrophic, severing a major artery. The entire assault lasted less than a minute. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the attackers turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness of the surrounding streets. In shock and badly wounded, Stephen attempted to escape. He ran approximately 130 meters along Wellhall Road, driven by instinct and the desperate human will to survive. But the injury was too severe. Stephen collapsed on the pavement, bleeding heavily as his life drained away. Doreen Brooks survived. He had witnessed the attack. He would later describe the attackers and name suspects, but in that moment, all he could do was watch as his friend lay dying. Emergency services were called, but time had already run out. Stephen Lawrence was pronounced dead shortly afterward. He was 18 years old. What happened that night was not a random act of violence. It was a racially motivated murder, carried out with speed, intent, and hatred. And yet, as devastating as the attack itself was, the events that followed, the failures, delays, and decisions made in the aftermath, would prove just as damaging. Because while Stephen Lawrence lost his life on Wellhall Road that night, the fight for justice had only just begun. In the moments after Stephen Lawrence collapsed on Wellhall Road, there was still a chance, however small, that swift, decisive action might bring clarity, accountability, and justice. But almost immediately, that chance began to slip away. When police officers arrived at the scene, critical mistakes were made. Stephen was still alive when they reached him, yet basic first aid was not properly administered. Officers hesitated. Procedures were unclear. Minutes passed, minutes that would later haunt the investigation and Stephen's family alike. The crime scene itself was not treated with the urgency or precision that a murder investigation demands. The area was poorly secured. Potential evidence was contaminated or lost. Witnesses were not separated quickly or interviewed thoroughly. Details that could have strengthened the case were allowed to fade, diluted by delay and disorganization. Even more troubling was the fact that this was not an unpredictable crime. Local police already had intelligence about a group of racist youths operating in the area. Young men known for violence, known for carrying knives, and known for targeting black teenagers. And yet, despite this knowledge, officers failed to act decisively in the crucial hours and days following the murder. Duane Brooks, who had witnessed the attack, provided descriptions and later named suspects. His testimony should have been central to the investigation. Instead, he was treated with skepticism, subjected to doubt rather than protection. His account was questioned, minimized, and, at times, seemingly disregarded. Within days, 5 prime suspects were identified. Their names were known. Their whereabouts were traceable. And still, arrests were delayed. Homes were not searched promptly. Clothing that may have carried forensic evidence was not seized in time. Opportunities to gather decisive proof were lost, perhaps forever. As the investigation stalled, the message became painfully clear to Stephen Lawrence's family. This case was not being treated with the seriousness it deserved. What should have been a focused, determined hunt for a murderer began to look like indifference. Or worse, avoidance. For Doreen and Neville Lawrence, grief quickly turned into disbelief. Then, disbelief turned into anger. They watched as leads went cold, as explanations replaced action, and as the urgency they expected from law enforcement simply never arrived. This was no longer just about the murder of their son. It was about a system that seemed unable or unwilling to deliver justice. And as the weeks passed with no arrests and no accountability, it became clear that Stephen Lawrence had not only failed on the night he was attacked, but in the investigation that followed. And this failure would not remain hidden for long. Because what began as a flawed police inquiry was about to become a national scandal. As the police investigation faltered and weeks turned into months with no arrests, the Lawrence family came to a devastating realization. If they wanted justice for Stephen, they would have to fight for it themselves. Grief did not fade with time. It hardened into resolve. And at the center of that resolve stood Stephen's mother, Doreen Lawrence. Doreen was not a campaigner by nature. She had never sought attention or confrontation. But the loss of her son, and the indifference she encountered in the aftermath, forced her into a role she never asked for. Calm, composed, and unwavering, she began to ask questions that authorities seemed unwilling to answer. Why were suspects not being arrested? Why was evidence mishandled? Why was her son's murder being allowed to drift into obscurity? Alongside her husband, Neville Lawrence, Doreen pushed back against silence. They spoke to journalists. They challenged police explanations. They refused to accept that nothing more could be done. Every interview, every public appearance, was an act of defiance against a system that appeared comfortable letting the case fade away. When the Crown Prosecution Service announced that there was insufficient evidence to bring charges, the decision was devastating. But it was not the end. The Lawrences took the extraordinary step of pursuing a private prosecution against the suspects. It was a rare and costly move, driven not by confidence, but by desperation. The case ultimately collapsed, undermined by the same investigative failures that had plagued the police inquiry from the start. But even in defeat, the family did not retreat. Instead, they exposed what had gone wrong. They shone a light on mistakes that many would have preferred to keep hidden. Their persistence attracted public attention, and with that attention came uncomfortable questions about policing, about race, and about whose lives were truly valued by the justice system. The Lawrences were no longer just grieving parents. They had become symbols of resistance. Their fight transformed Stephen Lawrence's case from a stalled murder investigation into a national issue. What had once been treated as an isolated crime was now understood as part of a much larger problem. And as public pressure grew, it became impossible for authorities to ignore the reality unfolding before them. The failures surrounding Stephen Lawrence's murder were no longer private. They were public, and they demanded answers. The family's refusal to be silenced had set something in motion, something that would soon force Britain to confront truths it had long avoided. By the late 1990s, the murder of Stephen Lawrence was no longer just an unsolved case. It was a national embarrassment. Years had passed. Suspects remained free, and the questions raised by Stephen's family had grown too loud to ignore. Public pressure was mounting, and trust in the police was eroding. Something had to give. In 1997, following sustained campaigning by the Lawrence family and increasing media scrutiny, the British government announced a public inquiry into the handling of the case. It would be led by Sir William Macpherson, and its purpose was clear: to examine why the investigation had failed so completely, and whether deeper issues lay beneath those failures. What the inquiry uncovered was unsettling. Evidence of poor judgment, missed opportunities, and dismissive attitudes toward the Lawrence family emerged again and again. Witness accounts were overlooked, basic procedures were ignored, and throughout the inquiry, a pattern began to take shape, one that could not be explained away by simple incompetence. In 1999, the Macpherson Report was published, and its conclusions sent shockwaves through Britain. The report stated plainly that the Metropolitan Police Service was institutionally racist. It was a phrase that forced a national reckoning. For the first time, an official government report acknowledged that racism was not just a matter of individual prejudice, but something embedded within the structures and practices of a major public institution. The findings went far beyond the Stephen Lawrence case. They challenged how police forces across the country handled racist violence, how they treated victims and witnesses, and how accountability was enforced. The report made 70 recommendations, calling for changes in policing, education, and public life. As a result, the definition of a racist incident was reformed. Police procedures were rewritten, training was overhauled, new systems of oversight and accountability were introduced. The impact of the report reshaped British policing for generations. But for all the reforms it inspired, the Macpherson Report could not do one thing. It could not bring Stephen Lawrence back, nor could it put his killers behind bars. Justice, in the most basic sense, was still missing. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. The truth had been spoken aloud. The failures had been named. And the idea that racism within institutions could be openly acknowledged had changed the national conversation forever. Stephen Lawrence's death had forced Britain to confront itself, and while justice had not yet been delivered, the ground beneath the case was beginning to move. For years after the Macpherson Report, it seemed as though the Stephen Lawrence case had reached its final chapter. The reforms it inspired reshaped British policing, but the murder itself remained unresolved. The men long suspected of killing Stephen continued their lives as free individuals, while his family carried the weight of a justice system that had failed them. Then, slowly, the case began to stir again. Advances in forensic science, particularly in the analysis of microscopic evidence, offered possibilities that had not existed in the 1990s. Items once considered useless were re-examined. Clothing that had sat untouched for years was tested using new techniques capable of detecting traces invisible to the naked eye. What emerged from this renewed scrutiny was enough to reopen the investigation. In 2011, nearly 18 years after Stephen Lawrence was murdered, two men, Gary Dobson and David Norris, were charged with his killing. The announcement was met with a mixture of relief and disbelief. For many, it was a moment they had long assumed would never come. The trial that followed revisited the events of April 22, 1993, in painful detail. Evidence that had once been overlooked was now placed at the center of the case. The court heard how forensic fibers linked the defendants to Stephen's clothing, and how patterns of behavior pointed back to the night of the attack. In January 2012, the jury delivered its verdict. Gary Dobson and David Norris were found guilty of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. For the Lawrence family, the convictions brought a measure of justice, but not closure. Too much time had passed, too many failures had gone unanswered, and three other suspects had never been convicted. Justice, when it finally arrived, was incomplete. And yet, the verdict carried undeniable significance. It proved that persistence mattered. That truth, even buried for decades, could still surface, and that the fight waged by one family had not been in vain. Stephen Lawrence had been denied justice for nearly half his life, but in the end, his name was spoken in a courtroom not as a victim forgotten, but as a young man whose life and death had changed the course of British history. Stephen Lawrence did not live long enough to become the architect he dreamed of being. His life was cut short before his plans could take shape, before his ambitions could turn into reality. And yet, in a way few could have imagined, Stephen left behind a legacy far greater than the future he was denied. In the years following his murder, Stephen's name became more than a reminder of a single act of violence. It became a symbol of injustice exposed, of truth forced into the open, and of the power of perseverance in the face of systemic failure. His story reshaped how Britain talked about race, accountability, and the responsibilities of those entrusted with public protection. The changes sparked by Stephen's case reached deep into the fabric of British society. Policing practices were reformed. Hate crimes were redefined. Institutions were challenged to confront uncomfortable realities about bias and inequality. These shifts did not erase the past, but they altered the future, for victims who might otherwise have been ignored, and for communities that had long felt unheard. At the heart of this legacy stands Stephen's family. Doreen Lawrence, in particular, transformed personal grief into public purpose. Through decades of unwavering determination, she ensured that her son's name would not fade into silence. Her courage inspired countless others to speak out, to demand fairness, and to believe that change, however slow, was possible. Stephen Lawrence's legacy also lives on through initiatives established in his name, including foundations dedicated to education, opportunity, and inclusion. These efforts reflect the values Stephen himself lived by: hope, ambition, and belief in a fairer future. But perhaps the most enduring part of Stephen's legacy is the lesson his story leaves behind: that justice is not guaranteed, that institutions must be questioned, and that meaningful change often begins when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Stephen Lawrence was just 18 years old when his life was taken. He should have been allowed to grow older, to build, to create, to live. Instead, his death became a turning point, one that continues to shape Britain to this day. And as long as his story is remembered, Stephen Lawrence has not been lost to history. He remains a reminder of what was taken, of what was changed, and of why the pursuit of justice must never be abandoned. When we look back at the murder of Stephen Lawrence, it's impossible to see it as just one tragic night in 1993. What happened on Well Hall Road did not end with a single act of violence. It echoed across decades, exposing truths that many would rather have ignored. Stephen was an ordinary young man with ordinary dreams. He believed in fairness, he believed in opportunity, and he believed that the society he lived in would protect him. That belief was betrayed, not only by the men who took his life, but by a system that failed to respond with urgency, competence, and compassion when it mattered most. Yet this story is not defined solely by failure. It is also defined by resistance, by a family who refused to accept silence as an answer, by a mother who transformed grief into a force that reshaped a nation's understanding of justice, and by a case that forced Britain to confront institutional racism in a way it never had before. Justice, when it finally arrived, was imperfect and painfully late. It could not restore what was lost, and it could not fully account for every failure along the way, but it proved something essential, that truth can survive neglect, and that persistence can bend even the most resistant systems toward accountability. Stephen Lawrence should be remembered not only as a victim, but as a turning point. His life mattered. His death mattered. And the changes that followed stand as a reminder that progress is often born from tragedy, but only when people are willing to demand it. As we remember Stephen Lawrence, we are also reminded of a responsibility to question authority, to challenge injustice, and to ensure that no family has to fight as hard as the Lawrences did just to be heard. Because justice delayed is justice denied. And remembering Stephen Lawrence means refusing to let that happen again.